The VDC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Colombia and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemarie DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. But before we do that, I would ask everybody to mute the microphone. Somebody's microphone is still open.
Colombia, if you could please mute, it's Colombia. If you could please mute your microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemarie DiCarlo. Rosemarie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Venezuela is mired in a deepening, protracted crisis that only Venezuelans can resolve. Attempts at reaching a negotiated solution have been unsuccessful in spite of significant international facilitation efforts. The path of negotiation seems to be stalled. In a letter to the President of the Security Council, the government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela stated that on 3 and 4 May, and I quote, armed groups of mercenaries and terrorists, organized, trained, financed, and protected by the governments of the Republic of Colombia and the United States of America, illegally entered the Venezuelan territory, end quote. According to the letter, the declared objective was perpetrating criminal acts against the Venezuelan people to carry out selective assassinations of high officials of the government, including President Nicolas Maduro. The letter pointed to the involvement in the operation of an extremist sector of the Venezuelan opposition, referring explicitly to Deputy Juan Guaido, who is recognized by a group of member states as the interim president. According to the letter, the operation was frustrated by Venezuelan authorities, and as of 13 May, the Prosecutor General of Venezuela had confirmed the arrest of 47 people in relation to the operation. The governments of Colombia and the United States have rejected allegations by the Venezuelan government regarding their involvement. The leader of the Venezuelan opposition has also denied involvement in the operation and called for establishing a national emergency government. Mr. President, on 4 May, through his spokesperson, the Secretary General affirmed that we stand against any escalation of the situation in Venezuela, and that the way to resolve the situation is through political dialogue as well as full respect for human rights. There is heightened concern regarding the standoff and the absence of any serious negotiations between the main political parties in Venezuela, especially amid potentially far-reaching effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Until restrictions imposed by the pandemic forced the suspension of its activities, the Applications Committee of the National Assembly, established to work on the selection of members of the National Electoral Council, was the only formal space bringing together lawmakers from the government and the opposition. The committee was also significant in that it was poised to lay the groundwork for necessary agreements between the government and the opposition over the electoral calendar and process. Legislative elections are due before the end of the year. We have taken note of the position of members of the opposition that have called for presidential elections to take place together with legislative ones. We call on main political actors to engage in a constructive negotiation to create conditions conducive to the holding of credible, inclusive, and participatory elections. Mr. President, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the General Assembly has called for a global response based on unity, solidarity, and multilateral cooperation. The UN's COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan includes Venezuela. The 2020 plan is expected to request some $750 million to cover humanitarian needs of the most vulnerable Venezuelans and support their response to the pandemic. More funding is urgently needed. The government of Venezuela has been calling for a humanitarian agreement for health and peace among all political sectors. While such calls are welcome, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has received reports of detentions of political leaders and journalists reported on COVID-19, and threats and intimidation against health workers for expressing, for example, concern about the lack of equipment to fight the pandemic or for giving information on the number of cases. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has expressed concern about the excessive use of force in some countries, including Venezuela, in the context of protests for access to basic rights, such as food, water, and medicine. Politicization of humanitarian aid in Venezuela has continued during the pandemic and remains a major concern. Humanitarian aid provided by the United Nations and our partners across the country is governed by the principles of independence, humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. Mark Lowcock, the United Nations Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, has asked all parties to respect this principled humanitarian approach and not manipulate the needs-based assistance. Another concern are the nationwide fuel shortages, a key operational constraint for humanitarian organizations trying to sustain their response. The Venezuelan government attributes the fuel shortages to unilateral sanctions. While available social and economic indicators show that the economic crisis predates the imposition of economic sanctions, these measures are exacerbating an already critical situation. Mr. President, in his address to the G20 on 26 March, the Secretary General appealed for the waiving of sanctions that could undermine countries' capacity to respond to the pandemic. And in her update on Venezuela to the Human Rights Council on 10 March, the High Commissioner noted that despite exceptions to allow imports of medicine, food, and humanitarian supplies, public services and the general population continue to suffer from the impact of overcompliance from the financial sector. In the context of the pandemic, she has recently affirmed that humanitarian exemptions to sanctions measures should be given broad and practical effect. Mr. President, the UN system will continue strengthening its human rights and humanitarian action in Venezuela, as well as its response in support of Venezuelan refugees and migrants outside the country. According to official figures, as of early May, close to 5.1 million refugees and migrants have left Venezuela. More than 80% of this population can be found across countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Since the start of the pandemic, there are reports of Venezuelans returning to the country due to the loss of livelihoods. Eduardo Stein, the joint UNHCR-IOM Special Representative for Venezuelan refugees and migrants, has said that the pandemic exposes them to even greater hardship, as many are now struggling to survive away from home. He urged the international community to generously provide support through the Regional Response Plan for Venezuelans, which to date has only 4% of the required funds. In a statement on 15 May, the European Union and the Spanish government announced plans to convene an international donors conference in solidarity with Venezuelan refugees and migrants in Latin American countries. The conference will take place on 26 May and will be supported by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration. Mr. President, the Secretary General has repeatedly called for a negotiated solution among Venezuelans. He has supported international facilitation efforts and offered his good offices as well, if needed and the parties request them. We remain convinced that a real negotiation among Venezuela's main political actors is the only way forward. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, an agreement that strengthens democratic governance with full respect for human rights and the rule of law is more urgent than ever. We therefore call on all main political actors, to resume serious negotiations, and we urge all member states to stand behind this call. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements, and I first give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the Undersecretary General on Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Mrs. Rosemary DiCarlo, for the briefing. I want to indicate from the outset that the situation we are facing today is unfolding around Venezuela, not inside the country. The recent incidents of breach of Venezuela's sovereignty by foreign agents pose a direct threat to the country's peace, as well as to regional security and stability. And this situation is a clear violation of the UN Charter. To better illustrate the point of our meeting, I will summarize the facts. In the first days of May, an armed group of at least 60 people entered the sovereign land of Venezuela from the territory of neighboring Colombia on 2 vessels. 47 of them were arrested. Among them, 2 US citizens who confessed that their mission was, firstly, to train forces in neighboring Colombia for military operations in Venezuela, and secondly, to take control of an airport in order to secure transportation of President Nicolás Maduro to the United States. We also know about a contract signed on October 16, 2019 by Deputy to Juan Guaidó and the CEO of a US company, Silvercorp, Jordan Goudreau, for some $200 million US. The aim to remove current Venezuelan regime, I quoted. According to the available information, it was to be financed through Venezuelan sovereign funds expropriated by US from Caracas and kept in US banks. After the imposter president claimed that he has nothing to do with this contract, another financial document was published which demanded Juan Guaidó to make a down payment of $1.5 million to Silvercorp, dated April 28, 2020, just a few days prior to the so-called Operation Gideon. We would like to question what role neighboring Colombia had in this story. It's hard to imagine that this clandestine operation that originated on its soul was conducted without any knowledge about it. US authorities claim that they have nothing to do with this. We would be glad to believe them, but fail to explain that according to the contract, 2 American citizens were planning to take hostage of legitimate Venezuelan president and bring him to the US. For what purpose, may I ask? And how does it correlate with constant, all options are on the table type messages by US authorities to Caracas, including the recent announcement of a $15 million US bounty for President Maduro? Who else can be behind this mercenary adventure? Nepal, like President Pompeo once said on another issue? The facts provided to the Council by Venezuelan permanent representative in his letter of May 13 are self-evident. Fortunately, this invasion was exposed and diffused by Venezuelan armed forces. As a result, a significant number of firearms was confiscated, including high-caliber ones, all of which were meant to be used in order to trigger internal chaos and get hold of critical infrastructure and state institutions. This is an act of aggression, and it must be condemned. Mr. President, the Venezuelan government has warned numerous times about the preparation of armed attacks and training of paramilitary groups in the neighboring countries. Let me remind that the UN Security Council, I quote, condemns any state which persists in permitting or tolerating the recruitment of mercenaries and the provision of facilities to them with the objective of overthrowing the governments, end of quote. That was a direct quote from the resolution 239 of 1967, which appears to be grossly violated, as well as the Charter of the United Nations and the Declaration on the Inadmissibility of Intervention and Interference in the Internal Affairs of States, adopted by the General Assembly in 1981. Unfortunately, the United States has a history of treating the whole South America as its backyard, in accordance with the Monroe Doctrine, mothballed for some time until US administration decided to give it a second chance. Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in 1961, overthrowing Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, and the 1986 Iran-Contras file in Nicaragua, just to name a few. Today, Venezuela is on the US menu, and our American colleagues don't even make an effort to deny it. It's exactly because of this that the recent adventure of Silvercorp looms especially alarming. And we can't forget about the troubling context, the so-called counter-narcotics operation in the Caribbean, which is in fact a military one, that followed the announcement of the bounty for President Maduro. So we want to ask today, what is the real aim of the American Navy parade in the Caribbean? Are there more mercenaries on the ground in Venezuela? Who is responsible for attacks on Venezuelan critical infrastructure, including electricity networks? We also hope Washington fully realizes the risks of incidents when deploying USS Lassen, USS Preble, and USS Farragut in an area where Iranian oil tankers are involved in legal activity near Venezuela. I also want to use this opportunity and ask a question to our European colleagues who hastily recognized imposter president 2 years ago. How do you see his role now, once his role in this attempted coup d'etat, let's call the things by their name, has become so evident? How can legitimate Venezuelan authorities engage in negotiations with him after this? Mr. President, the absolute majority of the international community rejects military or subversive actions as an instrument in international relations. We appeal to all participants of today's discussion to unequivocally condemn the attempt of invasion into Venezuelan sovereign territory. It's time for all of us to speak in favor of the right of Venezuelans to solve their political disagreements themselves, including their right to choose their own leaders in line with the constitution of the country. The Russian Federation will continue to do its utmost to help Venezuelans in this endeavor. We urge everyone to join us and to refrain from diktat, ultimatums and sanctions or coercive measures in regard to this or to any other country. With this in mind, we have prepared a draft Security Council press statement to address the above-mentioned issues. It reads as follows. The members of the Security Council discussed the latest developments in and around the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The members of the Security Council rejected the use of or threat of use of force as stipulated in the UN Charter, reaffirmed relevant resolutions on the condemnation of terrorism in all of its forms and manifestations, and on the use of mercenaries. The members of the Security Council called for the current situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to be resolved through a dialogue by Venezuelans, without interference, through peaceful and political means, in line with Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, within the framework of its national constitution and in full respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Venezuela. We believe that such a short, politically neutral and concise text will raise no substantial objections by the Council members. We will distribute it immediately after my statement. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the United States. Kelly, please.
Thank you, Sven. Undersecretary General DiCarlo, I want to thank you for your briefing today. It is most unfortunate that some council members have insisted on wasting your time. The letter from the illegitimate Maduro regime that prompted today's meeting is, as such letters always are, a long-winded compilation of fantastical accusations and demonstrable falsehoods. Unfortunately, for the second time in less than a month, our Russian colleagues have indulged their client regime's habit of blaming others for its appalling choices. But I am here today to tell you that the United States has no plans to cooperate with such attempts to avoid responsibility. Since 2018, this corrupt, criminal, and illegitimate regime has overseen some 7,000, I'm going to say that again, 7,000 extrajudicial killings. It has used food as a political weapon. It engages in torture and human trafficking. And its strategy for combating COVID-19 involves detaining medical professionals and independent journalists who attempt to inform the public of the risk posed by the virus. There is no question that these are the regime's choices, freely made. Of course, it would be inconvenient indeed for the regime to acknowledge its decisions to murder, to starve, and to traffic the Venezuelan people. So instead, they attempt to distract and misdirect, as they are doing now with claims of a supposed coup attempt, with the aim of providing cover for even more extrajudicial killings and murders. President Trump and Secretary Pompeo have already made clear that the United States was not involved in Operation Get In. I'll repeat it again. The United States has not entered Venezuela and categorically rejects any claims to the contrary. The United States was not involved in the alleged armed incursion of May 3rd and 4th. In fact, only nations that appear to be violating Venezuelan's sovereignty are Russia and Cuba, who, without approval from the National Assembly, routinely send military officers and mercenaries into the country. I must admit, it is perplexing to see these self-appointed champions of the Venezuelan people doing everything in their power to prevent ordinary Venezuelans from even expressing their political desires, let alone acting on them. We encourage the Council to look closely into the role of the Maduro regime in creating this supposed crisis, and especially into interference by the vast Cuban intelligence apparatus in Venezuela. Furthermore, we reiterate President Juan Guaido's call for unbiased investigations into roundups, extrajudicial killings, and torture that have resulted from Maduro's repression. As the United States investigates the alleged operation, more details are coming to light. We cannot yet share with you all that we have learned, but we can say this. It is obvious that the alleged operation was discovered long before. It was even publicly noted almost a week before, as there was a public address by the regime laying out its plans and highlighting that any efforts had been fully penetrated by the regime. As these investigations move forward, our focus must remain on the Venezuelan people, on the return of genuine democracy to the country, on the delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need, and on the specific and undeniable abuses committed by the illegitimate Maduro regime. In the end, today's meeting is about whether we are willing, collectively and individually, to acknowledge plain truths. For our part, the Trump administration will not avert its eyes from the evil the regime has visited on the Venezuelan people. Thankfully, the same can be said for many council members here today, but not for all of them. And I can only hope that a time will come when all members, fit to disavow such willful blindness. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I now give the floor to China.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to thank the briefing by USG DiCarlo. China took note of the letter by Venezuela PR to the Security Council. Recent attempt against Venezuela threatens regional peace and security. It deserves great attention of the Council. China strongly condemns aggression into Venezuela territory and violation of its sovereignty. Any acts that target foreign leaders, threaten their people, or attempt regime change are a grave violation of the international law. It should be rejected by the international community. China urges the U.S. to abide by the principles and the purpose of the UN Charter, abide by international law and the basic norms of international relations. We urge it to stop meddling into Venezuela's internal affairs and stop using coercive measures against Venezuela. China supports the efforts of Venezuela government to uphold its sovereignty, independence, and stability. It is our long-held position that Venezuelan matters should be decided by Venezuelan people. Venezuela issue should be resolved only through dialogue and consultation in the framework of its constitution and law. We oppose to interference in Venezuela domestic affairs under any cover, military intervention, or any attempts to create instability or chaos in Venezuela and the region are not in the interests of any party, therefore should be rejected. The COVID-19 is spreading across the world. The priority for the international community is to cooperate and fight against the pandemic. We urge some countries to stop shifting blame and politicizing the pandemic and focus on containing its domestic crisis and carrying out global cooperation. The international community should act in line with the overall interest of Venezuelan people and the region. Promote the peaceful resolution of the issue, as well as regional stability. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Rhonda, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I begin by thanking USG DiCarlo for her remarks, and I recognize the presence of my colleague PRs of Venezuela and Colombia. Mr. President, this situation is not only close to home for us in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, by means of geographic proximity, it is also an enduring feature in the hearts and minds of many across the Caribbean region as we stand in solidarity with our Venezuelan brothers and sisters. Today, we reaffirm the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and call on all member states to recommit to their obligations under international law. The recent attempted armed incursion into the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is only the latest in a long series of unwarranted aggressions meted out against this sovereign nation over the past 2 decades. We maintain that the internal political dispute within the country does not constitute a threat to international peace and security. More pointedly, the situation in Venezuela does not threaten the national security, territorial integrity, or political independence of any external state party, and all acts of aggression, including unilateral economic coercion, carried out under these guises are unjustifiable and illegal. These flagrant violations of international law undermine the internal political processes within the country. And now, following the $15 million bounty offered for the capture of the country's duly elected leader, new sources of instability, including mercenary activity and terrorism, have precipitated an increasingly volatile environment. These acts of solicitation serve to inflame rather than quell the challenges facing the country and its people. We maintain that the only sustainable solution to the political crisis is an inclusive national dialogue that meets the legitimate needs and aspirations of the Venezuelan people, free from any geopolitical machinations designed to interfere with the outcomes of this internal political process. We are deeply concerned about the worsening humanitarian situation in the country. The conversions of external economic and political forces to further the so-called regime change agenda places unnecessary strain on the socio-economic fabric in Venezuela and produces immense hardship and suffering of the people. Again, we reiterate our calls for an immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all unilateral punitive measures and urge all members of the international community to desist from all aggressions against the sovereign rights of the country and political freedoms of its people. During these unpredictable times when efforts to combat the COVID-19 pandemic should be consolidated, these geopolitical maneuvers are both unhelpful and detrimental. Mr. President, at a time when our multilateral system is faced with a crisis of credibility,
you are the only participant.
We can't afford to deviate from the rules and norms of international cooperation. In defense of the bedrock principles of international law, we must not sow seeds of discord nor fan the flames of provocation. The Venezuelan people deserve so much more. Before closing, Mr. President, my delegation wishes to support the press statement as proposed by the Russian Federation earlier. We consider it to be factual and balanced. I thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda. I now give the floor to France.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. Mr. President, as members of the Security Council, we have the responsibility to contribute constructively and to political and peaceful solution to political crisis. And it is in that spirit that we approach today's discussion on the situation in Venezuela. And I wish first to reaffirm that the solution to the Venezuelan crisis can only be found in full compliance with international law and the Venezuelan constitution. And the use of force must be strongly condemned without exception. Respect for international law naturally also applies to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and Venezuela has an obligation to guarantee the normal functioning of all foreign embassies in Caracas. In response to the Venezuelan political crisis, France, together with its partner in the European Union and Latin America, has engaged in diplomatic efforts with the creation of the International Contact Group to promote a resolution of the crisis through dialogue, by taking into account the results of the Oslo-Barbados process, among other elements. Inclusive and good faith dialogue is indeed the only way forward with a view to the organization of free, transparent, and credible elections. Venezuelans must be able to...
No, sorry, Venezuela, please mute your microphone.
Yes, I think you will be given a chance to speak later. Venezuelans must be able to freely choose their future, and the prerogative of the National Assembly must be respected in accordance with the Venezuelan constitution. Venezuelans are the first victims of the crisis, which has lasted too long. Millions had to flee their country, And we want to pay tribute to the generosity of the many neighboring countries that have demonstrated that generosity in welcoming and protecting them. The European Union has shown its readiness to support these countries and will hold on May 26th a donors conference together with UN agencies in the wake of the Solidarity Conference that was held in Brussels in October 2019. Our response to the crisis must be inclusive and collective under the leadership of the UN, and it must take into account the dangerous spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, whose humanitarian and socio-economical impacts in the region could be terrible. Secondly, the Venezuelans are also suffering from the economic consequences of the political crisis, and we call on all actors to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access and to reject any politicization of humanitarian aid. This is all the more necessary in the context of this COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, the Venezuelans are suffering from serious and repeated human rights violation, and France calls on Venezuela to implement all of the recommendations of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, particularly with regard to the release of political prisoners. We recall that the European Union sanctions are individual measures adopted in response to this human rights violation, and that they are designed not to affect the population and the response to the pandemic. So as you can see, France, together with its European partners, is committed to all aspects of the Venezuelan crisis, political, humanitarian, and human rights. And we call on all parties to resume dialogue, because this is the only way out of the crisis. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup. And now I give the floor to the Dominican Republic. Jose, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to express our sincere appreciation to Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her insightful briefing. The Americas, our region, is one of peace. We have a rich and successful history of democratic transitions that have ultimately translated into sustainable development despite the many challenges. At the outset, let me be clear about the position of the Dominican Republic, not only in this particular case, but in regards to any other matter involving accusations of this magnitude. We reiterate our full respect and commitment to the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations for the collective benefit of safeguarding international peace and security. The Dominican Republic rejects any threat or use of force against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of any country. Our demonstrated interest in the resolution of the Venezuelan crisis was evident when we facilitated a dialogue between the government and the opposition in Venezuela in order to clear the path to a democratic process in the country. All these efforts were made in solidarity and based on our clear conviction that it's only through a dialogue and peaceful means that a solution for the crisis in Venezuela can be achieved. Likewise, we vehemently reject and condemn any act of terrorism as unjustifiable under any circumstances, recognizing the need to combat as well the illicit trafficking of drugs, money, small arms, and light weapons and persons by international criminal organizations. The regional implications of this crisis are great, but they are greater for the Venezuelans. As refugees or enduring a harsh economic crisis for years now, they are the ones paying the highest price. In this context, we continue to have serious concerns about the dire humanitarian situation in Venezuela, particularly amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and sincerely hope that priorities be established on providing and facilitating assistance to those in need and undertake the necessary measures to contain the spread of the virus. Allowing for a democratic transition without further delay to take place through the holding of free, fair, and credible elections need to be at the center of all international efforts with full respect of the UN Charter and the legitimate aspiration of the Venezuelan population, including those living outside their country. In light of the accusations presented and the discussions thus far, we also call for a factual and independent investigation before jumping prematurely into conclusions. We long for a path for Venezuelans where the fulfillment of their inherited individual and collective rights and aspirations are guaranteed. A prosperous Venezuela regaining its rightful place in the orchestra of democracies of the Americas. I thank you.
Thank you, Jose. And now I give the floor to Tunisia.
Thank you, Sven. We thank OSCE Rosemary DiCarlo for her insightful briefing. Venezuela is in the midst of a tense political standoff and socioeconomic meltdown, which risks to be highly exacerbated by the devastating impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the population. We regret to note that the polarization in Venezuela has continued to deepen and to abort attempts of reaching a negotiated solution between the main political actors. We are concerned to note as well that the current standoff and the absence of any space for constructive negotiation between the parties is potentially adding complexity to the situation and undermining the stability of the region where tension is looming. It is the third time in less than 1 month this topic is on our agenda, but the Council, despite the good intention of its members, is not speaking with the same voice on this issue. This cannot help walk Venezuela to stability. Tunisia remains convinced that a negotiated political solution is the only way forward. This is even more important in the COVID-19 pandemic context. We stand ready to support any initiative by the Security Council in this regard, as well as any good offices by the SG, should they be requested. We call on all the main actors to put aside mistrust and animosities to work solutions that meet the aspiration of all Venezuelans to peace and welfare and consolidate stability in the region. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to South Africa. Cherry, please.
Mr. President, we thank you for convening this meeting, and also thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for the information she gave us. I want to join colleagues in welcoming to our meeting the PRs of Venezuela and Colombia, and we hope to hear more from them. Mr. President, I will focus my intervention today on 3 issues, namely political situation, humanitarian situation, and the exacerbating impact of COVID-19 pandemic, and regional peace and security. Firstly, regarding the political situation in Venezuela, its view that only Venezuelan-led political dialogue will resolve the political challenges facing the country. In accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, Venezuela's sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected. And therefore, Mr. President, any attempts at an unconstitutional change of power of a democratically elected government in Venezuela should not be accepted. The international community should rather support a Venezuelan-owned internal peace process and resolution without imposing any preconditions. Time and time again, we have witnessed the disastrous impact of attempts to forcefully and unconditionally change a government, including protracted conflicts and instability that reaches beyond borders and region. We do not wish this for Venezuela. In this context, Mr. President, we emphasize the imperative to respect the Constitution of Venezuela and its provision on separation of powers, like in all our countries. Furthermore, we reiterate our view and underline that in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, the sovereignty and integrity of Venezuela should be respected by all, and no attempt should be made by anyone to violate it. In the same vein, we wish to emphasize the position of principles of non-interference in internal affairs of any countries. Mr. President, on COVID-19 pandemic, Zambia expressed its concern the devastating impact of COVID-19 pandemic across the globe, and particularly those countries affected by conflicts and instability. The pandemic requires all of us to draw from the deepest wealth and wells of global solidarity and cooperation. During these trying times, colleagues, focus should be on addressing humanitarian needs and concerns of countries such as Venezuela, which are enduring economic and political challenges as a result of a myriad of causes, not least of which the prevailing economic restrictions imposed externally and also exacerbated effects of COVID-19. South Africa therefore urges all countries to respect the need for impartiality, neutrality, and independence in the provision of humanitarian assistance to Venezuela. Humanitarian assistance should not be used as a political bargaining chip, which holds the people of Venezuela and those most vulnerable to ransom. We appreciate the work of the United Nations system in assisting Venezuela to address humanitarian situation, as well as indispensable work of the World Health Organization in helping the country to deal with COVID-19 pandemic. In this regard, Mr. President, South Africa fully supports the calls for enhanced international solidarity and the removal of economic sanctions that will severely limit the ability of countries to recover from the pandemic. We also support the call for a global ceasefire in all parts of the world, including in this hemisphere. We must be clear that our common enemy today is COVID-19 pandemic and nothing else. Our narrow national agendas should be set aside as we gently address this pandemic. I quote Congresswoman Barbara Lee this morning when she was addressing the African Dialogue series. She said, "No one is safe until all are safe." Close quote. Mr. President, South Africa is concerned by the increasing tension in this region and urges all countries to heed the call of the Secretary General for Solidarity at this time of global crisis and not perpetuate division and friction. This solidarity and unity of purpose is essential in assisting the world emerge from the pandemic, which minimize adverse impact on international peace and security. Finally, Mr. President, as South Africa once more, as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, calls for the peaceful resolution of the Venezuelan political crisis, we appeal for considered global effort to assist via as many initiatives as possible and as many countries as possible here today to assist Venezuelans to overcome their differences and to converge in a series of consultative dialogue internally till a peaceful political settlement is reached. For the sake of its people, its neighbors, and all of us, we owe, colleagues, to millions of people throughout the world who laid their lives so that today we can celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations and its Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Jerry. I now give the floor to Vietnam. Queen, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank CUSG Rosemary DiCarlo for briefing, and I welcome the permanent representative of Venezuela and Colombia to our meeting today. Mr. President, we received a letter from Venezuela, and today we follow very closely the brief by USG DiCarlo and statements of previous speakers. We feel deeply concerned over the recent reported armed incursion into Venezuela. Vietnam strongly opposes the use of force or threats of use force against sovereignty and independence, and interference of any forms in internal affairs of any state, which violates the Charter of the United Nations and run counter to international law. In this regard, we would like to stress the following points. First, we call on all parties related to the situation in Venezuela to exercise self-restraints and refrain from the use of force or threat to use force, or action that may escalate tensions and destabilize the situation in Venezuela. It is the Council's responsibility to uphold the fundamental principle of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, abide by international agreed norms in the conduct of international relations among states. Second, we support the constitutional government and relevant party in Venezuela to engage in dialogue with a view to achieving a long-term solution by peaceful means. The way forward for Venezuela could be led and decided by Venezuelans themselves, in line with its constitution and its people's aspiration, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and international law. Third, as ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated the situation in Venezuela, the most important task now is to combat the pandemic and provide humanitarian assistance for Venezuelans to overcome the current difficulties. In this connection, we would like to welcome further UN-led effort to help the people of Venezuela in accordance with the principle of humanitarian assistance and the need of the Venezuelan people. We also strongly support the appeal by the Secretary General to waive sanctions that can undermine the capacity of states to respond to the pandemic. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Kui, and then now give the floor to Niger.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing on the situation on Venezuela. Mr. President, since 2013, Venezuela faced a political crisis coupled with an humanitarian and migration crisis. It is in this difficult context that the COVID-19 pandemic is taking place, adding another challenge for the country. My delegation remains convinced that the situation in Venezuela and the political crisis that continues today require an internal political process rather than foreign intervention. To that end, Niger encouraged all parties to refrain from provocative measures which threaten to further complicate the situation and to give priority to a comprehensive and inclusive national dialogue with the good offices of the UN Secretary General. My country appeals to the Council, the international community, and all partners involved in this crisis to bear in mind the interests of the Venezuelan people who are suffering from this situation. We call upon them to contribute positively to the resolution of the crisis and to avoid action that could jeopardize an internal solution to the conflict or be interpreted or perceived as threat to peace and security of the country. My country reaffirms its commitment to the principle of the UN Charter, respect for the independence of state, sovereignty, and interference in their internal affairs, principles that are value and position of the non-alignment movement. In conclusion, Niger calls on all parties, both internal and external, to refrain from provocative measures and to favor dialogue and negotiation in the best interest of Venezuelan people. For Niger, a political crisis requires a political solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Germany. Jürgen, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Sven. And first of all, thanks to Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. Mr. President, in our view, the Council members need to focus on the most pressing issue at hand, and this is the unprecedented humanitarian emergency the Venezuelan people are suffering through, and the overwhelming need for a political solution. We are aware of the Maduro regime's attempts to instrumentalize some reported incidents to divert the world's attention from the real issues. We see this as an effort at diversion by a regime that is responsible for the protracted political crisis and dire economic situation Venezuelans from all walks of life suffer from. We as the Security Council should not fall into this trap. If we really care about the fate of millions of Venezuelans and about regional stability, we need urgent action now. The only way forward is through a peaceful and Venezuelan-owned political process, indeed. We strongly renew our call for the restoration of the democratic institutions and the rule of law in Venezuela through free, transparent, and credible presidential elections. The European Union, through the International Contact Group, stands ready to support this process. And echoing the Secretary General's call to unite in our shared battle against COVID-19, now is the time to overcome the political deadlock and find an agreement, possibly within the framework of the Oslo process, which Germany has always strongly supported. We also support the proposal for a transitional government for Venezuela, representing both sides, to pave the way towards presidential and parliamentary elections, and to unite in order to jointly respond to the challenge posed by COVID-19. We urge the Maduro regime to finally engage in meaningful negotiations. Mr. President, in the context of a collapsing infrastructure, mass migration, and a government in denial about the humanitarian emergency, COVID-19 could have disastrous implications for Venezuela. Humanitarian actors need unimpeded and sustained access to the most vulnerable people and must be able to deliver humanitarian assistance in full accordance with the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We urge the Maduro regime to grant this access nationwide. Humanitarian assistance must never be exploited for political purposes or be misused as a propaganda tool, and the politicization of the delivery of humanitarian assistance runs counter to the humanitarian mandate and undermines the safety and security of humanitarian workers. We call instead for a united attempt to combat COVID-19 that includes all political actors. The National Assembly of Venezuela has made a number of constructive proposals to strengthen the country's healthcare system. The authorities in Venezuela and the international community must use all available resources at this point in time. This requires all of us to provide sufficient humanitarian assistance, first and foremost through the United Nations. Let me reiterate in this context that the EU sanctions do not stand in the way or impede the global fight against COVID-19, or more broadly, the provision of humanitarian assistance. On the contrary, EU sanctions such as asset freezes and travel bans are targeted. That means aimed at those responsible for the policies or actions that violate international law or human rights and aggravate conflict. To be perfectly clear, EU sanctions imposed against Venezuela do not apply to humanitarian assistance and humanitarian activities, including medical assistance. Mr. President, alarmed that with the arrival of the pandemic in the country, intimidation and threats against health professionals, members of non-governmental organizations, journalists, and human rights defenders have increased yet again. This is unfortunate and must stop. We therefore urge the Maduro regime once again to release all political prisoners, especially bearing in mind the consequences of the current pandemic under conditions of detention. Now, before closing, Mr. President, let me recall that more than 5 million Venezuelans have fled to neighboring countries,
often in search of medicine and basic health services. Sadly, the COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbates their plight. This is the biggest refugee crisis in Latin America's history. On May 26, Germany will participate in a donor conference which the EU, together with Spain, will host for Venezuelan refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jürgen. And now I give the floor to Belgium. Mark, tu as la parole.
Thank you, Sven. Thank you, Rosemary, for the briefing. The incident described in the letter from the permanent representative of Venezuela and in the Russian request for today's meeting frankly raises a lot of questions. Where is the line between fact and interpretation? Where is the line between reality and assumptions? Who is benefiting most from this situation? How can we access neutral, non-partisan information? To be clear, Belgium condemns the use of mercenaries in all circumstances, and we are of the view that relevant instruments under international law should be applied to those crimes. We condemn the use or threat of force and stress the importance of respecting each country's sovereignty. We also emphasize the importance of respecting human rights, including in anti-insurgency operations. As I said, this incident raises many questions, but there are a few things we know with certainty. First, we know the population of Venezuela is suffering. We remain very worried about the human rights situation, the absence of the rule of law, and the lack of democracy in the country. This situation has led to an exodus of historic proportions. We emphasize the need for transparent, free and fair presidential and parliamentary elections and denounce the ongoing intimidation of members of the National Assembly, who must be allowed to exercise their parliamentary mandate. Second, we know that there can only be a political solution to the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. The recent events divert attention from the man-made humanitarian crisis, which is further being exacerbated by COVID-19. We hope the pandemic can serve as an opportunity to focus minds and to working together in confronting this common challenge. Third, the politicization of humanitarian aid is unacceptable. We reiterate the importance of respecting the humanitarian principles and the need for full and unrestricted access. The threat posed by COVID-19 does not exempt governments from their obligations under international law, in particular human rights and refugee law. Finally, we know, and the population of Venezuela knows, it can rely on the support of the European Union and its member states. On the humanitarian side, the EU remains the largest humanitarian donor in Venezuela. Politically, the EU-led international contact group will continue to support all initiatives in good faith that lead to a peaceful and democratic resolution of the crisis. President, the political deadlock in Venezuela remains profoundly problematic and negatively impacts regional stability. We call on all stakeholders to engage in a credible, representative and serious negotiation process, such as the one facilitated by Norway. The only way forward resides in political terms. Thank you.
Merci, Marc. And I now give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I join others in thanking USG DiCarlo for her. Mr. President, today we have been convened to speak about what is essentially an independent operation by a rogue group of mercenaries and speedboats, not a threat to international peace and security. The United Kingdom rejects the ridiculous notion peddled by the Russian Federation that this incident was a US and Colombian-supported attempt to assassinate Maduro and impose a substitute government, and as the Maduro regime has alleged in its letter to the Security Council. It does, however, this discussion, give the Council a useful precedent in scrutinizing such adventurism by others into sovereign territory in the future. And I, for one, welcome the Russian delegation's condemnation of a violation of national sovereignty by mercenaries. We hope this means that they will themselves be changing the approach they take in Libya and elsewhere, as the Council heard earlier this week. Indeed, we were glad to hear many Council members defend territorial integrity and sovereignty, and we hope to hear similar sentiments, especially put as vehemently by the Russian delegation when we discuss the illegal annexation of Crimea tomorrow. For our part, we have seen no evidence that the US or Colombia were involved in this operation. To the contrary, both governments have taken steps to address the involvement of individuals from their countries. We welcome the US government's announcement that it has begun investigations into the activities of Silvercorp, its owner Jordan Goodrow, and the failed operation, and we welcome the Colombian authorities' launch of investigations into the incident. The opposition to any form of military intervention in Venezuela is a principle with which the UK firmly agrees. But, Mr. President, as we have said many times on this subject, the only positive way forward for Venezuela is through a negotiated, democratic and peaceful solution stemming from free and fair presidential elections in accordance with international norms. Such negotiations must be approached with a genuine will on both sides to constructively engage. So far, we have seen the spirit of engagement on the side of interim President Juan Guaidó, who has engaged in several dialogue initiatives, but not from the side of the Maduro regime, as was recently seen when they rejected the US democratic transition framework without considering its potential. Instead, attempt to divert attention from the humanitarian catastrophe his regime has brought upon its own people by drawing the world's attention to a small group of mercenaries who, it seems, were far from being in a position to inflict serious harm on Maduro or his regime. So it is this behavior, rather than failed adventurism, that worries us and on which should be focused. The Maduro regime has also used the COVID-19 crisis to divert the international community's attention, focusing, for example, on the thousands of Venezuelans who have returned to their country. As USG DiCarlo told us, economic pressure on migrant communities grows, rather than focusing on the 5 million who have left Venezuela, with more than 1.8 million of them alone given a welcome in Colombia. Maduro does everything in his power to draw attention away from the humanitarian crisis and the human rights violations he is perpetrating against his own people. The regime continues to repress the opposition, stifle media freedom, and harass journalists and human rights defenders, and it is now failing to guarantee basic rights to those detained as part of this operation. So we call on the Maduro regime to treat these detainees and others in accordance with international human rights standards, including their access to family, to fair trial, and to choose their own defense. And we further call on the regime to allow unhindered humanitarian access, as called for by Mr. Lowcock, for all Venezuelans in need, and to depoliticize humanitarian aid. This is a crucial time for the Venezuelan people, when the challenges they have already faced are being exacerbated by COVID-19. And finally, Mr. Maduro to constructively engage in dialogue as soon as possible so that the Venezuelan people can move forward in freedom and democracy. This is what they need, and this is what they deserve. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Indonesia. Johnny, please.
Thank you so much, Sven. Thank you, President and dear colleague. First of all, to thank USG DiCarlo for your briefing. And it seems that I'm the last speaker before you, President, so I have the luxury of hearing what colleague has been saying before me. Now, let me begin by once again reiterating that Indonesia's position on the situation in Venezuela has always been clear, consistent, and principled. We have had the opportunity to express our position several times. For us, dialogue, reconciliation, and negotiation remain the preferred option for the durable resolution of all issues. Having said that, let me make 3 very brief points. First, the principle of non-interference, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter should be the starting point in discussing any issues in the framework of the United Nations. This is also the case for the situation in Venezuela. It is imperative to respect those fundamental principles. With that in mind, we appeal to all parties involved, both within and outside Venezuela, to put serious efforts in reducing tensions and not exacerbate the situation. We like to echo also Rosemary's points, and that is only Venezuelan can resolve the protracted crisis. Second, it is important for us, the Security Council, to be united and take the right action. Within less than 1 month, the Council has met 3 times to discuss the situation in Venezuela. These efforts have so far failed to make any difference for the people and the country. Even last time we met, we could not agree on the press elements. Indonesia regrets that we have been unable to achieve unity in the Council on a mechanism for us as a respected body to move forward to address the situation of Venezuela, including its already dire humanitarian challenges. Despite our diverging views in the Council, Indonesia still believes that it is possible for us to arrive at a consensus in line with our responsibility and mandate. And that brings me to my last point, that any solution for the situation in Venezuela should be focused on an inclusive political dialogue involving all parties. To that end, there is an urgent need to address the large trust deficit in the country. We therefore call all parties to accept the good offices offered by the Secretary General and again urge restraints against any action that could result in further deteriorating in the already fragile situation on the ground. Mr. President, in this time of COVID, the humanitarian needs of the most vulnerable Venezuelans, including refugees and migrants, in response to the pandemic is imperative. If we really care about the people of Venezuela, and as I believe we do, the first point is that we must demonstrate a united front in the Council and find a common ground. Alas, we have continuously expressed the view of having a united front, but it is a pity that we have not done so, as we have heard in the many divisive statements of this afternoon. This is the time for us to put aside our differences and to ensure that we will be part of the solution and not be part of the problem. We still have the obligation to find ways and means to assist Venezuela and its people to find a peaceful solution to their current challenges. Let us show the people of Venezuela that we will be with them and we will not leave them in despair. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Johnny. And I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Estonia. First, I would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing on the situation in Venezuela. And the situation is very concerning. The further deterioration of the political crisis and its destabilizing effects across the region must be addressed. The lack of dialogue of the regime with opposition is steadily increasing the suffering of Venezuelans. Estonia firmly believes that a peaceful and inclusive democratic transition is the only sustainable solution to the current political deadlock and the severe social crisis. We are concerned about the reports on human rights violations against protesters, civil society activists, and human rights defenders. The authorities must secure freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, protect peaceful protesters from violence, as well as investigate all violations and ensure accountability. The people of Venezuela are in urgent need of humanitarian aid. The current pandemic has worsened the situation even more. We urge all relevant actors to take all necessary measures to secure safe, full, and unhindered access of humanitarian aid to all people in need and to ensure the safety of humanitarian workers. The EU is the largest donor to the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis, providing more than half of all funding. Finally, more concerted efforts are needed to meet the extremely urgent needs of Venezuelan people. We support United Nations efforts as well as the efforts of all other key players. I now resume my function as President of the Council. And I now give the floor to the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this meeting to discuss the situation in Venezuela, especially the terrorist attack that took place on May the 3rd, as well as the looming threat of a new armed attack in an imminent breach of the peace in my country, should the aggression continue. Before reading my speech, I just got a piece of news. The President of the United States of America, Mr. Donald Trump, just declared publicly the following regarding Venezuela. He just said, "We have got it surrounded at a level that nobody even knows. We're going to see what happens." This is the kind of language of a gangster. This is not a language of a head of state. This is the kind of language that represents a violation of international law at so many levels, and is the best introduction for my speech. Mr. President, when signing the UN Charter, we all committed to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace. Today, this provision is being violated with impunity and in contempt of the Charter. In a letter to the Security Council dated May 13, 2020, we demonstrated the world the armed aggressions against my country, which, as per public and irrefutable evidence, proved that the governments of the United States of America and Colombia facilitated the planning, training, financing, and still today are protecting groups of mercenaries and terrorists who executed an armed attack with the objective of penetrating first indiscriminate killings of innocent civilian population. Second, selected killings against high-level officials of my government. And third, the very same assassination of President Nicolas Maduro. This is a manifest violation of the UN Charter, international law, and multiple resolutions of the Security Council, which are legally binding to all member states. The government of Colombia and the United States of America violated their obligations under international law, particularly the ones provided by the following 4 resolutions. A, Security Council Resolution 239, which condemns that a state permits or tolerates the recruitment of mercenaries and the provision of of facilities to them with the objective of overthrowing the governments of states members of the United Nations. B. Security Council Resolution 1269, which calls upon states to prevent and suppress in their territories through all lawful means the preparation and financing of any acts of terrorism. C. Security Council Resolution 1373, which decides that all states shall both refrain from providing any form of support to entities or persons involved in terrorist acts, including by suppressing the recruitment and the supply of weapons to terrorists, and denies safe haven to those who finance, plan, support, or commit terrorist acts. D. Security Council Resolution 1456, which calls upon states to assist each other to the maximum extent possible in prevention, investigation, prosecution, and punishment of acts of terrorism wherever they occur, while stressing that states must bring to justice those who finance, plan, support, or commit terrorist acts or provide safe havens in accordance with international law, in particular on the basis of the principle to extradite or prosecute. As of today, the governments of the United States of America and Colombia continue to refuse any sort of contact with relevant Venezuelan authorities in order to establish the facts and avoid impunity by ensuring that those responsible are brought to justice. As a result, those governments violate their obligations under existing bilateral treaties on mutual legal assistance in criminal matters. Even more, the US government continues to provide safe haven to the leaders of the armed incursion against Venezuela. Mr. President, today I must report that the operations to capture the individuals who were involved in this armed aggression are still ongoing, as we are aware of the existence of other groups of mercenaries and terrorists who were trying to carry out their criminal plans in other regions of our country. As a matter of fact, an attack against our national water system took place on May the 14th, which, apart from constituting itself a clear violation of Security Council Resolution 2341 on the protection of critical infrastructure from terrorist attacks, confirms the veracity of the public statements of the criminals who still remain at large regarding the preparations of new aggressions and the training of new groups of mercenaries and terrorists. All this occurs while further evidence continues to see the light, clearly pointing to both Washington and Bogota as the main plotters behind the aggression. Moreover, there are at least 3 additional developments that I must denounce today, as they are part of the continued campaign of aggressions against my country. Firstly, on May the 13th, the US government included Venezuela in an unlawful and unilateral list to falsely blame my country as one that does not cooperate with counterterrorism efforts. What a cynical accusation, which comes days after an armed attack with mercenaries and terrorists, with full support of US government officials and the direct participation of US citizens and companies. In addition, the following day, on May the 14th, a senior Trump administration official told Reuters agency that consideration was being given to the designation of several Venezuelan security agencies as terrorist organizations. This is a manifest threat to the peace and security of my country, as the US government is aiming to fabricate a narrative in which, according to the supremacist notion that claims that its national laws are universal, it may take decisive action and proceed with the assassination of top officials from Venezuela's securities agencies, and by using its propaganda machine, then twist the crime and present it as a counter-terrorist operation. Mr. President, it is a sad fact of our times that the US government expects to openly get away with murder by normalizing the unlawful killing of top national officials around the world through the sheer use of brute force. Secondly, as we had announced in previous letters to the Security Council, the US government has openly admitted to exert pressure on companies to refrain from supplying gasoline to Venezuela, thus resulting in the current shortages that exist today throughout the country. And in this context, just allow me to pose this following rhetorical question. What would happen if, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, New York City is deliberately left without gasoline? This would indeed amount to a crime against humanity, which is precisely what the government of President Trump is perpetrating against 30 million Venezuelans. Today, the coercion is coupled with a new peril, the threat of use of military force against 5 Iranian tankers with fuel that are en route to Venezuela, in violation, among others, of the freedom of trade and navigation. In case this threat is materialized, it would constitute an actual armed aggression against a civilian Iranian vessel and against the Venezuelan people as a whole. In this context, it shall be stressed that a naval blockade is an act of war under international law, particularly if not authorized by the UN Security Council on the basis of Article 41 of the Charter, or applied pursuant to the right of self-defense. Therefore, the current threats of the US administration are nothing more than a military act of aggression against a civilian vessel carrying vital goods for our people and coming from a country that has engaged in legal trade with mine. In the midst of a pandemic, forbidding those vessels from reaching our ports would constitute a crime against humanity. Perversely, the US government insists to portray itself as our savior, claiming to be the major donor of humanitarian assistance to Venezuela, and now even dares to accuse our government of obstructing the provision of US assistance, when the truth is that everyone willing to support our country has been able to do so through the United Nations agencies. Thirdly, on May the 13th, international media revealed the existence of a Venezuelan reconstruction unit within the British Foreign Office, through which discussions were held between British officials, figures of the Venezuelan opposition, and the plotters of the recent armed attack on the need to provide, this is incredible, on the need to provide a special status to British business in my country after the aggression was successfully carried out. The new evidence has now seen the light, together with the pillage of over $1.7 billion in Venezuelan gold by the Bank of England. We are suing the Bank of England, by the way. Demonstrates once again how the British government is an opportunistic accomplice in the colonial looting of Venezuelan wealth. In addition, British warships remain in a hostile attitude, together with Dutch, French, and US warships, conveniently disguised as anti-drug trafficking operations, but actually aimed at illegally establishing a naval blockade against our nation. The use of military threats with propaganda operations is a replay of the old trick of plausible deniability used in covert assaults. I must also report, this is incredible, the mind-blowing news that just hours ago, international media, I repeat, revealed that a powerful Colombian drug trafficking organization known as Los Pachenca, which controls the northern region of La Guajira and which supported the mercenaries and terrorists that participated in the armed attack on May the 3rd against my country, this organization is in possession of precise operational details on the surveillance routes and the locations of Colombian and US warships in the Caribbean. This official and top secret information is being used by the cartel to avoid the very same military forces that are patrolling the area, allegedly for counter-narcotic purposes. This proves that the real objective of warships in my region is not to fight drug trafficking, but to attack Venezuela instead. This is yet another evidence of the coordination that exists between the intelligence agencies of those countries and narco-paramilitary groups. It is a classic example of all the options are on the table. This is a strategy of clandestine war against Venezuela, even using as its cover an alleged war on drugs. Behind it all, there is the same mind that applied this same combination in Nicaragua during the 1980s. That is, the use of drug lords, covert operations, mercenaries in a dirty war. Cruelly, one of those individuals who was responsible for this over 30 years ago is now repeating his crimes today in Venezuela. Literally the very same individual. I am referring to Elliot Abrams, one of the darkest characters in our region's history. Mr. President, in 1974, General Assembly adopted Resolution 3314, which defines an aggression as the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations, and include as such acts both the blockade of the ports or coasts of a state by the armed forces of another state, and the sending by or on behalf of a state armed bands, armed groups, irregulars, or mercenaries which carry out acts of armed force against another state. Mr. President, this text perfectly fits the description of the recent events in Venezuela. Consequently, while urging the Security Council to fulfill its duties in relation to the maintenance of international peace and security, we request it to once and for all determine, first, the threat that the warmongering policies of the governments of Colombia and the United States of America represent to the peace of Venezuela and the region. Second, to recognize the acts of aggression that have been committed against my country. And third, demand the perpetrators to immediately bring to an end the threat of use of force and the commission of further armed attacks, including through the use of mercenaries and terrorists. The US government and its allies are creating a lawless space in international relations, where they can ignore their obligations under international law and impose tyrannical, whimsical, and colonial practices over the rest of the world. Thus, the supremacy of their national interests justifies the most abhorrent crimes, as is the case of protecting the good terrorists and good mercenaries that attack Venezuela, if they serve well the expansion of US power. The Security Council must enforce the notion of legality in international relations under the principle of no consideration of whatever nature may serve as justification for aggression. This is the only way to further peace and security among nations. Today, in the middle of a deadly pandemic that is affecting all of humanity, and which requires the full attention of our national government to protect the life of our people, we are facing an imminent armed attack that, for its genocidal effects, amounts to a crime against humanity. Given the seriousness of the situation and its potential escalation, the inaction of the Security Council at the current juncture will embolden those governments to continue with the warmongering and criminal plans. It is a fact that the Colombian and the United States governments have doubled down their aggression against Venezuela in contempt for international law and the UN Charter, in a demonstration of their unrepentant and recidivist nature. Allow me to conclude, Mr. President, by insisting that our country does not represent a threat to anyone and expects that everyone learns the following lesson. Venezuela is not for sale. It will never be a colony of anyone. And our people, with serenity and determination, will fulfill its duty to be free. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Colombia, Guillermo. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this session on Venezuela, a sister country facing a colossal crisis. My country has a history tradition of respect for democracy and international law. It has been a strong advocate for multilateralism and dialogue to resolve differences. Colombia, as well as more than 50 countries and multilateral organizations, has disavowed for over a year the illegitimate Maduro regime and recognizes interim President Juan Guaidó. As a part of the Lima Group and along with other countries, it supports its efforts to restore democracy in Venezuela. Mr. President, the relationship of Colombia with Venezuela is a strategic issue. The tie bonds forged by proximity have guided our international policy. Both nations share a long history and an extensive border that has been described as the most alive border in America. Over the past 2 decades, Colombia has implemented a policy aimed at integrating and supporting social and economic development of border regions and their communities. However, these efforts stand in stark contrast to Venezuela's permanent support for terrorism and its collusion with transnational organized crime, thereby affecting Colombia's national security and the stability of the region. Both Chavez and Maduro turned systematic conspiracy theories against the regime, purported attacks, all fails once, or attacks against Venezuela's sovereignty, all of them under control, into the core tenet of their propaganda. It is the regime's hostile policy against Colombian institutions that goes against the rules of international law and the resolution of the United Nations and the Organization of American States. Mr. President, Venezuela has been driven into a multi-dimensional crisis. It has gone from being one of the most prosperous nations in Latin America to a situation of profound deterioration. Today, is widely considered a failed state. Between 2014 and 2019, Venezuela lost 2/3 of its wealth. High inflation stood close to 10,000% last year. Its oil production went from 3 million barrels a day in 1999 to 622,000 barrels a day in April of 2020, and half of its population is in a situation of multidimensional poverty. Who could believe that the country with one of the largest oil, gas, and mineral reserves in the world will end up in scarcity, lacking food and medicines, with shortage of electricity and water supply, and insufficiency of gasoline for domestic consumption? Mr. President, the human rights situation in Venezuela is unprecedented. Since 2003, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has reported on the clear weakness in the fundamental pillars for the existence of the rule of law. Furthermore, since 2018, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has noted patterns of violation that affected absolutely all human rights. The High Commissioner has also documented the increasing repression of political dissidents and the subjection of detained persons, including children, to various forms of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishing, such as beating, electric shocks, suffocation, and threats of sexual assault. More than 5 million Venezuelan citizens have to abandon their homeland due to poverty and repression. As a result of this unprecedented exodus, more than 1 million Venezuelans have established their residence in Colombia. Confronted with this challenge, ranked as the second largest displacement crisis in the world, Colombia has acted with unfailing fraternity and solidarity, investing significant financial and institutional resources, which continue to be committed despite the emergency caused by the COVID pandemic. Acting in response to a humanitarian call by the Venezuelan National Assembly and interim President Juan Guaidó, on February 23, 2019, an effort was made to provide Venezuelan citizens with food and medicines that were urgently needed. My country, along with Brazil, Curaçao, Chile, Paraguay, the United States, and Puerto Rico, allocated humanitarian supplies at the border in the city of Cúcuta with the intention of delivering them to volunteers who would carry them to Venezuelan territory. The Maduro regime responded with violence, and the paramilitary armed groups known as the Collective frustrated the delivery of the provisions. Tensions at the border led to the expulsion of all Colombian diplomatic and consular personnel from Venezuelan territory, and diplomatic ties were broken. Mr. President, the Lima Group has repeatedly appealed for a democratic transition in Venezuela that will allow for the restoration of the rule of law and the reconstruction of the economy. And in making this call, however, the Lima Group members have always stressed such process must take place peacefully under the terms of the Venezuelan Constitution. The European Union, as was mentioned today, has also promoted initiatives such as the International Contact Group aimed at facilitating a path towards the recovery of democratic institutions in Venezuela. Norway and Sweden have also undertaken efforts to find solutions to the crisis through dialogue. Unfortunately, the regime has proven its unwillingness to abandon the position of oppression against the people of Venezuela. Corruption and other criminal activities provide enormous proceeds to Maduro and his collaborators. Losing their capacity to control these activities would surely affect their lucrative business, even if this means maintaining Venezuelan citizens deprived of goods and services essential to their survival. According to Transparency International Perception Index, Venezuela is the most corrupt country in Latin America and the fifth most corrupt in the world. Recently, the United States Attorney General charged Maduro and 14 other current and former officials of the regime with formal criminal charges for narco-terrorism and corruption. Among others, these charges also include former FARC leaders Ivan Marquez and Jesus Santrich. Mr. President, the government of Colombia acts in strict observance of international law in the aim of seeing Venezuela's democracy restored and has not carried out any covert or hidden action. On the contrary, It has deployed all diplomatic efforts within its reach and has spoken in various forums on the abuses committed by the regime against the Venezuelan people. In May 2017, President Duque, a senator at that time, filed complaint before the International Criminal Court against Nicolás Maduro for the commission of crimes against humanity. In May 2018, the Secretary General of the Organization of American States also submitted a report before the ICC Prosecutor's Office in which he demonstrated there is no access to a fair justice system in Venezuela. In September 2018, the heads of state of Argentina, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Paraguay, and Peru put forward a new communication to the ICC, formally requesting the opening of an investigation into the commission of crimes against humanity under the Nicolás Maduro regime. France later supported this communication. Likewise, the member states of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance agreed to activate the organ for consultation of the instrument, and in September 2019, they adopted a resolution considering that the set of criminal activities associated with the humanitarian crisis generated by the deterioration of the political, economic, and social situation it represents a threat to the maintenance of the peace and security of the continent. Mr. President, the illegitimate regime of Maduro irresponsibly accuses Colombia of tolerating the commission of crimes that may affect Venezuela. But nothing is farther from reality. Some examples of the action of the Colombian authorities in the matter of law enforcement and prosecution of criminal structures can be found in the document that I delivered today to the President and all the members of the Security Council. Several of the criminals that the regime of Venezuela mentioned in recent complaints have been imprisoned since last year. Regarding the seizures of weapons in events that occurred on March 23rd, 2020, the allegations are once again false. From the moment the seizures occurred, Colombian judicial authorities issued an arrest warrant against the person in possession of the weapons, and a criminal notice was issued. An investigation is underway. Mr. Cliver Alcalá, who claimed responsibility for acquiring safe weapons, is the subject of an open investigation by the Colombian Attorney General Office. He voluntarily surrendered to the U.S. authorities in order to collaborate with the criminal proceeding against him in this country. The events of the so-called Operation Gedeon are also under judicial investigation. Regarding the false accusations purporting to involve the Colombian authorities in action of use of force against international law, it is imperative to reiterate the Minister of Foreign Affairs communiqué dated May 7, 2020, that strongly rejects those claims. Colombia has never been an aggressor country. On the contrary, it has devoted its efforts to strengthening its institutions, consolidating its institutional capacities to ensure stability and security, and raising the quality of life of its citizens. We have pursued a persistent battle against crime and have made significant economic and social progress since the beginning of this century. Mr. President, members of the Council, allow me to express clearly our strong rejections of allegations purporting to link my government to actions against international law. The restoration of democracy in Venezuela is a shared purpose and a moral imperative. The Security Council can be certain that Colombia does not pose a threat to international peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo. I would now like to ask Madam Di Carlo, would you like to have some additional remarks or not?
Mr. President, I think I listened to all the comments, but I have nothing further to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As there are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers, the meeting is adjourned.